No one woman better personifies the Victorian West than Elizabeth Bacon Custer. She is remembered as the beautiful and devoted wife of George Armstrong Custer, the controversial Indian fighter and Civil War hero. But Elizabeth Custer was much more. After Armstrong Custer's untimely death at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Elizabeth Custer emerged from her husband's shadow to become a noted writer, lecturer, and one of the most powerful widows in American history.
I see my country prosperous, strong, and sure of its destiny. And I know, as the wife of every hero knows, that in some small measure, my life has contributed to that. Elizabeth Custer, 1927.
To this day, Elizabeth, to me, still seems an elusive character. When I look at her diary, I find her a very complicated individual. I am convinced that the public figure that she projected was not always a reflection of the inner Elizabeth Custer.
She came the pathetic figure in Widow's Weeds, which seemed to hold the shadow of a heartrending tragedy. Candace Wheeler, 1877.
I think there is a myth has grown up that Libbie Custer is a sweet, gentle lady who everybody should feel sorry for. That's part of the myth-making about Mrs. Custer. She was a very powerful lady.
From famous wife to powerful widow, Elizabeth Custer rewrote history to create one of the greatest legends of the American West, George Armstrong Custer. But who was the woman behind the legend? Fact and myth are oftentimes blurred.
I think that she created her own myth. It is a pretty picture. The real Libbie Custer was considerably more complicated than the myth would indicate. And there are dark spots in it.
She was born Elizabeth Bacon, better known as Libbie, on April 8, 1842 in Monroe, Michigan. Her parents, Daniel and Eleanor Sophia Bacon, were devout Presbyterians. Libbie's father was a Monroe judge.
There were 4 children born to the couple, but Libbie was the only child to survive. She had a privileged background in that her family was definitely upper middle class. Elizabeth Custer was a person who, even as a young girl, liked excitement. She was a little bit of a tomboy. She liked to climb trees. She liked to ride horses.
Libbie spent a happy childhood in Monroe until age 12, when her mother died of dysentery. Libbie wrote in her diary,
"My mother is laid in the cold, cold ground, never to rise again. Why did they put her in that black coffin and screw the lid down so tight?" Libbie Bacon, August 27, 1854.
Judge Bacon, distraught by the death of his wife and the responsibility of caring for his only child, sent Libbie to live at the Young Ladies Seminary School in Monroe. Libbie overcame the death of her mother by excelling in academics. In June of 1862, she graduated valedictorian of her class.
We were all proud of Libbie when it came to her valedictory. There was scarcely a dry eye. So many were there who had watched her through her motherless girlhood. Rebecca Richmond, June 1862.
Libbie returned home after graduation to live with her father and new supportive stepmother. There she quickly became the belle of Monroe, Michigan.
She was a fairly good artist and was hoping that she would have been educated well enough to go to the New York School of Design. And those were her plans until that fateful evening.
That fateful evening was at a Thanksgiving party in November of 1862. Several Union soldiers on leave from the Civil War attended. There, Libbie was introduced to George Armstrong Custer, a rising star in the Union Army. George Armstrong Custer and Libbie Bacon were as different as they come. He was born into a modest family from New Rumley, Ohio, where his father was a blacksmith. Custer, whose nickname was Audie, spent his adolescent years living in Monroe, Michigan, before attending West Point Academy. There he graduated last in his class.
I think the The principal contrast between the two would be that he was always boyish, never with a very clear-set group of goals in mind, whereas she was determined and manipulative and intent on achieving certain very clearly defined goals.
Libbie and George came from different sides of the track, and her first impression of him was quite negative indeed. And Elizabeth thought that this young man, who seemed to favor the company of girls of less virtue than she, was not worthy of her attentions.
I believe he liked me, but he was in too much haste, though I admire his perseverance. Elizabeth Bacon, 1862.
If you look at Libbie's pictures carefully, that you can see that behind that prim and proper exterior, there is very definitely a very lively young woman. And I think Custer sensed that from the very beginning. He was persistent, and Elizabeth liked that persistence. And also, too, I think Custer was unpredictable, and that made him somewhat dangerous and therefore also more intriguing as well.
When she did realize that she cared for him, her father found out about it and became furious and put a stop to the relationship. Judge Bacon didn't want his daughter to marry a soldier. He knew the kind of lives they lived and that their life expectancy was not great.
But Libbie and Custer began having clandestine meetings until he was called back to war.
I never was kissed so much before. My forehead and my eyelids, cheeks and lips bear testimony, and his star scratched my face. If I could only see him tonight. Elizabeth Bacon, 1863.
Custer's success on the battlefield also gave him success in love. Once he's promoted to brigadier general, once he's the hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, then it's all right with Judge Bacon, finally, for George to correspond with Libbie. And George suddenly becomes a much more attractive catch to Libbie than he had ever been before, now that he's sporting those stars on his shoulder.
Once given permission to correspond, Custer accelerated their courtship by immediately proposing to Libbie.
His words linger in my ears, his kisses on my lips. Oh, I have 1,000 doubts, though shall sometime be his little wife. Elizabeth Bacon, 1863.
We now return to famous women, Libbie Custer.
On February 9, 1864, George Armstrong Custer married Elizabeth Bacon in a religious ceremony at Monroe's Presbyterian Church. Libbie battled with her father to keep her maiden name, but in the end, Libbie Bacon became Libbie Custer.
Father, I have proved my admiration for your belief in self-made men by marrying one. Elizabeth Custer.
The newlyweds embarked on a honeymoon, traveling to Buffalo and New York City. Finally, they reached Washington, D.C., where Libbie took up residence and Custer returned to the war.
My own darling boy. Yesterday after you went, I watched you admiringly as you rode along, then went up to my room to cry.
Normally, Libbie and Audie would write every day. At one time, Audie had to reprimand her for what she was writing in the letters. One day, his ambulance was captured by the South, and his letters from her were in them, and some of them were printed in the newspaper, and I guess they were pretty erotic for that time period.
My beloved darling, I don't care if 50 rebels read this letter. I miss your kisses. Libbie, 1864.
I think their story is very much a love story. I don't think it's necessarily a love story in the traditional sense. The marriage was a very passionate marriage in which the two of them enjoyed a very healthy sexual and emotional relationship in which the two of them would almost move heaven and earth to be together.
When Libbie and Audie were separated, they were very lonely. When he would come back, she would hear him in the middle of the night if he arrived, running up the stairs. She said that a sound that has stayed with her all through the years was the sound of the saber hitting the stairs as he raced up.
While away at war, Custer encouraged Libbie to dance and dine with Washington's finest.
George encouraged her to keep the company of important politicians and generals, to use her beauty and her wiles to ingratiate the Custers as a couple to these powerful patrons. And she played the game beautifully. And much of Custer's advancement was won not just on the battlefield, but by the efforts of his wife, taking care of the political wars back in the nation's capital.
Though still enjoying gentleman's society, nobody could misconstrue my laughing and talking as flirting. Though I have a pretty face, it is my husband's reputation that brings me so much attention. Elizabeth Custer, June, 1864.
The Custers soon became one of the most talked about couples in the country. Custer, the brigadier general, and Libbie, his idyllic wife. In 1864, Libbie was invited to the White House, where she was introduced to President Abraham Lincoln.
So this is the young woman whose husband goes into a charge with a whoop and a shout. President Abraham Lincoln, 1864.
Libbie, who hadn't been impressed with Lincoln before, advised one of his secretaries,
"Tell Mr. Lincoln he would have gained a vote if soldiers' wives were allowed one."
Libbie not only experienced Washington's pomp and circumstance, but also its death and despair.
The mortality rate in the hospitals is something frightful. This is the saddest city, with maimed and bandaged soldiers in the streets and the slow-moving government hearses. Elizabeth Custer, June, 1864.
Nowhere could you turn without seeing a man with a bandaged arm or head, and it affected her quite deeply. She said that it aged her and she didn't think she'd ever feel young again.
Union casualties were mounting, but Custer's victorious battle at Cedar Creek awarded him another star.
My dear father and mother, Armstrong is now a Major General. People are beginning to call me Mrs. Major General, but I have been too well trained by you to be stuck up. Libbie Custer, October 25th, 1864.
Custer, now a brevet Major General at age 25, requested that Libbie come join him at the front in Martinsburg, Virginia.
You will lead a real soldier's life. Do not come if you do not desire it. Good night and a kiss from your devoted boy, Audie.
I love luxury, dress, comfort, but oh, how gladly I will give them up. I can hardly wait. Libbie.
Elizabeth was unusual in the amount of time she spent near the front. General Sheridan, however, banished most of the women from his camp. He told Elizabeth that her husband was the only one of his generals who hadn't been spoiled by marriage, that he could still count on him to lead those incredible charges without worrying about the girl he left behind.
During the Civil War, the soldiers seemed to like her. They would remember her from when they had first seen her riding across Virginia with her costume on. They would say that they would walk 40 miles to see Mrs. Custer, but they wouldn't walk 10 miles to see one of the generals from the war.
Libbie's boy general triumphed in battle after battle. Custer's crowning glory came on April 9, 1865, at the Battle of Appomattox, helping to overtake General Lee's army.
At war's end, when Custer and Sheridan were both present at McLean's house where Lee surrendered to Grant, Sheridan purchased the table upon which the conditions of surrender were written and presented it to Custer to give to Elizabeth.
My dear madam, I respectfully present to you the small writing table. There is scarcely an individual in our service who has contributed more to bring this about than your very gallant husband. Yours very respectfully, Phil Sheridan, April 10th, 1865.
One war had ended, but another war was about to begin. A controversial war between two cultures awaited Libbie Custer on the western frontier.
We now return to famous women Libbie Custer.
After the Civil War, men and women ventured west for opportunity and adventure. The Custers were no exception. Libbie saw the western frontier as the place where her husband could reclaim the glory he once had during the Civil War, and in doing so, she too could achieve success.
Audie, I see every day that great ambition I have for you, and I bask daily in the sunshine of your glory. Libbie Custer.
In 1866, the Army summoned Custer to lead the 7th Cavalry on an expedition to the western frontier. Settlers and railroad workers needed protection from mounting Indian attacks. Libbie was the only wife to accompany the column on their road to frontier glory.
Custer was dominated by a drive to succeed. Elizabeth shared those dreams. There were simply no avenues for social advancement for women in Victorian America. But for someone as bright as she was, as driven as she was, her best opportunity for success was through the reflected glory of her husband.
Libbie rode right along with the Army, so she had to learn to dress under the most difficult of situations when they were on the march. Her greatest fear was holding up the column. She just didn't know what would happen if, Audie would have to go out and say, "Excuse me, Libbie isn't dressed yet, we'll be leaving in 5 minutes." So she dressed as quickly as possible, and Audie used to time her.
The wives of Army officers endured a great deal of hardship. The government was not supporting them. The government did not ever officially recognize the existence of wives anywhere. And so the military officers had to go to a great deal of expense, discomfort, and hardship in order to have wives with them.
The Custers were soon stationed at various garrisons and tented camps across the state of Kansas.
I am never happier than when sleeping in a tent. It is so comfortable. A part of the regiment is still in camp, so that I am not afraid near such a large body of men. Elizabeth Custer, Fort Hays, Kansas, 1866.
She dealt with constant fluctuation in temperature, severe storms, hail, snow, bitter cold, searing heat. But she's an officer's wife. You got to remember that. And therefore, she didn't have to get up and stoke the fire in the stove to keep warm or to cook breakfast. There were servants to do that.
Eliza, a self-freed slave and Custer's cook during the Civil War, followed them west and performed all the domestic duties.
Libbie Bacon Custer was not domestic at all. In fact, she says that her father gave Audie a great chance to get out of the marriage beforehand by saying that she knew nothing of dishwater. She says she was in the kitchen only 3 times that she remembers, and one was when Eliza was sick.
Libbie and other military wives spent most of their time entertaining the soldiers, who often remained idle at the camps for months at a time.
Wonderful woman she was, highly intellectual, and she seemed to make both the trouble and happiness of her husband's officers her personal interest. Katie Gibson, 1871.
Though frontier life was rugged and desolate, Libbie wrote about her longing to have children.
She wrote a letter to Armstrong, and in that letter she told him that she had been to church and she had prayed to God to give her a child. As to why the Custers didn't have children, I don't think that the historian can answer that question. All that I can tell you is that Elizabeth wanted children very much.
In 1867, Custer was ordered to track down a band of Cheyenne warriors. The campaign, however, was unsuccessful, and desertion among his men was rampant. Lonely and depressed, Custer wrote a frantic letter to Libbie.
Dear Libbie, I was not impatient then as now. I almost feel tempted to desert and fly to you. George Armstrong Custer, 1867.
Libbie always came first, and his dedication to his military career after he got out onto the frontier was not all that single-minded.
Custer, in a bold move, deserted his detachment at Fort Wallace and rode 150 miles with 70 men to Fort Riley to see Libbie.
Custer, in his memoirs, claimed that he left his detachment to race to her rescue when cholera had ravaged the fort at which she was waiting for him. But there's another story. Captain Benteen reported that Elizabeth had engaged in a daring flirtation with Captain Tom Weir. Now, whether this flirtation had ever become a physical relationship, we'll never know. But that's why he left his regiment.
Weir I reprimanded sharply in writing. The more I see of you, little one, the more I am surprised that a woman of your moral training could have entertained the opinion of him you have. George Armstrong Custer, 1868.
I think that she had a flirtatious relationship with Weir. I don't think that it ever grew any more serious than that, although apparently Custer thought it did. I don't think Libbie ever had any infidelity in that marriage. She was too much the product of Victorian morality.
I think both of them also wanted to keep the other one just a little bit insecure so that they would never take one another for granted. And it was a game that both of them played.
Custer was suspended from duty for 1 year for reasons including abandoning his post and excessively marching his men. The Custers returned to Michigan, but Libbie never forgot her husband's gallant sacrifice to be with her.
We now return to famous women, Libbie Custer.
In the winter of 1868, the Custers were called back to the western frontier.
General Sheridan was determined to break Cheyenne power once and for all, and so he decided upon a winter campaign. But he needed a forceful, courageous officer to lead his main strike force, and so he got Custer recalled from Michigan.
In November of 1868, Custer charged Chief Black Kettle's Cheyenne village, located along the shores of the Washita River.
Dear Libbie, I have only time to tell you of your husband's grand success in killing 103 Indians and capturing 1,000 horses and much of their property. General Philip Sheridan, 1868.
To General Sheridan, Custer was a hero, but the press and public criticized him for killing peaceful Indians and imprisoning their women and children.
Elizabeth shared her husband's views on Indian policy. While she might have sympathy for the plight of the Native Americans, she nevertheless loyally stuck with the military view that the Indians must be subjugated.
My danger in connection with the Indians was twofold. I was in peril from death or capture, and liable to be killed by my own friends to prevent my capture. Elizabeth Custer, 1868.
The proposition that those wives were exposed to Indian dangers is almost a total fabrication. There were a few isolated incidents. Libbie would have shared the prevailing Victorian view of Indians, which was an ethnocentric view, one of patronizing them, one of condescending to them, but one withal of being very, very fascinated.
The following summer, Libbie visited the stockade where the Cheyenne were held prisoners. One of the Cheyenne women she met was Monacita.
Monacita was the daughter of Chief Little Rock, one of the Cheyennes at the Battle of the Washita. The evidence is pretty conclusive that Monacita was occupying Custer's tent with him. Cheyenne tradition says it happened. There's no question in my mind that there was a liaison with Monacita.
Despite the popular mythology of the Custers as the most devoted of couples, they had problems. Captain Benteen said that Elizabeth knew what was going on and that Custer had flaunted Montecito before her. Considering Custer's previous writings and letters to Elizabeth about his relationships with women in New York, this makes perfect sense. Custer would often go east without Elizabeth to New York, telling her how he was keeping company with beautiful actresses and how, of course, they fawned all over him. And then, of course, always adding at the end that she knew he was completely devoted only to her.
You are irrevocably my first, my present, and my last love. All the women are but as mere toys compared to you. George Armstrong Custer, May 1871.
I think that their marriage was not the idyllic, ongoing love story that she portrayed, but in the final analysis, these two people needed each other. And irrespective of the difficulties that they had in their marriage, centering around Custer's inability to give up gambling and difficulties arising from Custer's very close relationship with other women, the two of them considered each other the most important people in their lives.
In 1873, the 7th Cavalry was transferred to Dakota Territory. For Libbie, Fort Abraham Lincoln was the first place that felt like home.
Life for the Custers at Fort Lincoln was probably the best that it had been. It was the first time that they had a real home. All of their friends were with them. They would have various entertainments. The Custers would put on amateur theatricals where they would take different parts and make costumes. And they would have, of course, music.
While Libbie enjoyed the comforts at Fort Lincoln, Custer and the 7th Cavalry were sent on a quest for gold.
In 1874, Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills of South Dakota to see if it had any gold in it. Rumors of gold in the Black Hills had been going on for decades, and Custer even had a couple of prospectors with him. And indeed, they did find gold. This touched off a wave of miners and settlers into the Black Hills, which was part of the Indian lands. Legally, they were trespassing on Indian land, no question about it.
The Black Hills was sacred to the Sioux Indians and protected under the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie.
A number of Indians, including those of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, they did not sign the Treaty of 1868. The Indians retaliated. They were angered that once again they were being pushed off their lands by the whites, and it resulted in more open warfare.
I well remember how the great chiefs of the Sioux came frequently to General Custer's quarters. After they were gone, the general would say, "The government must keep its promises to the Indians." Elizabeth Custer, 1876.
Warfare against the Sioux appeared imminent, but Libbie had other plans for Custer.
Custer was not a cerebral or deeply intellectual person. It was Elizabeth who was pushing him constantly to write, pushing him constantly to better himself, to bring out the intellectual side. It was Elizabeth who made Custer the man of letters.
Libbie encouraged Custer to write magazine articles and a book about his life on the plains. She hoped he could find a more lucrative career in New York as a writer, but Libbie's dreams for Custer were never fulfilled.
The military would come in 1876 and force all Indians to remove themselves from the unceded Indian territories and must report to a reservation by the end of January 1876, or else they would be considered hostiles by the government, and a military expedition would be sent to force them to either surrender or to fight.
On June 26, 1876, Custer led the 7th Cavalry on its last march out of Fort Lincoln. Libbie had a premonition of disaster. As the regiment marched away, Libbie noticed a mirage in the sky. She wrote that Custer seemed to march into the clouds toward a dark destiny.
It was a splendid picture. The flags were flying, the men were waving. In a few seconds, they had disappeared. and we never saw them again. Elizabeth Custer, 1876.
On a hill near the Bighorn River in Montana Territory, Custer and the 7th Cavalry were overrun by thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors in bloody warfare that lasted but an hour. When it was over, Custer and more than 260 soldiers died in what was called the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The news shattered Libbie Custer.
When finally the news came, late one night, Elizabeth couldn't engage in the grief that must have overwhelmed her, but rather asked for her shawl and went with the officers to notify the rest of the widows.
When I heard the news, I wanted to die. Elizabeth Custer, June 27, 1876.
After his death, she, of course, experienced a tremendous depression. And in fact, General Nelson Miles visited Fort Abraham Lincoln, and he said that her depression was so thorough, so deep, that he really worried about her physical and mental health.
Libbie returned to Monroe, Michigan to the homestead she inherited from her father, but her depression deepened. Rebecca Richmond, Libbie's cousin, wrote her a letter of inspiration.
Dear Libbie, the mantle of your hero husband has fallen upon your shoulders. Wear it, Libbie, for his sake. Rebecca Richmond, 1876.
Rebecca's letter enlightened Libbie. After months of isolation, she emerged from the shadows of depression, ready to meet her next challenge.
We now return to famous women, Libbie Custer.
As with the death of her mother, Elizabeth Custer overcame the loss of her husband with strength, determination, and her tremendous will to succeed.
When there's a widow, there's a way. When there's a will, there's a widow. Elizabeth Custer, 1898.
George Armstrong Custer not only left Libbie a widow at age 34, but he also left her penniless. For the first time in her life, she needed to find work.
When George Armstrong Custer died, Elizabeth discovered that his indebtedness amounted to about $13,000, which was a tremendous amount of money back in those days. What had happened in the last year of Custer's life is that Custer had been playing the stock market, actually with money that was not his own.
Audie had a lot of debts. His insurance policies covered much of them, but that left her only with a few $100s, and there was no work in Monroe that she could do, so she headed east.
In 1877, Libbie packed her bags and moved to New York City to begin a new life.
When she got to New York, she got a job as secretary for the Decorative Arts Society, which was a ladies' society which helped widows and other women place handmade objects, embroidery, pottery, that sort of thing. Eventually, she started writing for the newspapers.
Elizabeth Custer's real work, however, remained on the battlefield of the Little Bighorn. No sooner had the mutilated bodies of the 7th Cavalry been buried than accusations soared. Who was responsible?
I regard Custer's massacre as a sacrifice of troops brought on by Custer himself that was wholly unnecessary. President Ulysses S. Grant, 1876.
Custer was made the scapegoat by military and political figures for what had happened. Now, this was outrageous. Custer had indeed been lax in following his orders, but he hadn't disobeyed orders. The campaign had been botched from the beginning, and the fault for what happened lay at the door of the Grant administration. But quickly, everyone blamed Custer, including Grant. And now the only one left to come to his rescue was his poor widow. And she came charging in a way that would have made George proud. She disarmed his critics. She silenced them.
Everybody loved Libbie Custer, and even Custer's bitterest enemies loved Libbie Custer. And so there was indeed a conspiracy of silence among those who would have attacked his actions at the Little Bighorn openly.
Libbie was determined to make Custer's death a symbol of patriotism. She approached magazine writers, Army officers, and a biographer to portray Custer as a boy's hero.
A remarkably quiet, thoughtful man who never came flurried and excited in the hottest battle. Frederick Whitaker, biographer, 1876.
Her dedication to her objective did, in large measure, succeed in transforming a very human man, highly controversial individual with certainly his share of faults, into a very attractive Christian soldier. I think what gave Libbie tremendous authority is that Libbie was perceived as having been a model wife and then later having been a model widow.
As she had basked in his reflected glory while Custer lived, she now could achieve greatness only if he was a success after his death. In being the main architect of the so-called Custer myth, in being the main architect of one of America's great legends, she also gave herself an avenue for continued success.
In the summer of 1877, Libbie worked to have all soldiers' remains exhumed from the battlefield and brought back east for proper burials.
Custer was returned to West Point. The ceremonies, however, were delayed at Elizabeth's request until the fall so that more people could be in attendance and school would be in session. And it was indeed a grand ceremony and helped to put her husband's name on the front page of every paper in the country.
Libbie longed to have a monument that reflected the real Custer, a soldier mounted on his horse. Congress and much of the country responded to her wish. On the 25th anniversary of his death, President Taft and over 25,000 people attended a grand ceremony in Monroe, Michigan. There, Libbie unveiled an equestrian statue of Custer.
Never was anything more lifelike and beautiful. My dream of so many years was a reality to me. Elizabeth Custer, June 5th, 1910.
Through his death, Libbie became the person she wanted Custer to be. She wrote 3 books and traveled back to the West lecturing about her frontier experiences. She toured Egypt, Europe, China, and Japan. And by the beginning of the 20th century, Libbie Custer was living on Park Avenue.
She did fulfill his dream of living the good life in New York City. This was where they loved to go. They loved the sights and sounds of the city. And I think both of them had an interest in making money. When she really began to make money was when she went on the lecture tour. And she took in a portion of the ticket sales.
By the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a national reconciliation was sweeping the country. A half-century later, both Indians and soldiers reunited at the battle site.
Years ago, we had a fight here with Custer. We wiped him from the face of the earth. But now we are brothers under the same flag. White man runs him, Crow Scout.
Old wounds were healing for many, including for Libbie Custer. But after 50 years, she still couldn't bear to return to the battlefield where her husband died. However, she listened to the ceremonies on her radio.
There was a time after the Battle of the Little Bighorn when I could not have said this, but as the years have passed, I have become convinced that the Indians were deeply wronged. Elizabeth Custer, August 1924.
Elizabeth Custer wrote she only had 2 regrets in life, that her husband died and that she didn't have a son to carry on the Custer name. But for 57 years, she devoted her life to perpetuating Custer as a mythic hero.
I think many people discovered that he was not the model individual that she had made him out to be, And anytime that happens, then there is a disillusionment that sets in.
If it hadn't been for Elizabeth, certainly the luster would have tarnished on Custer's reputation much quicker. Everyone held their tongues and held their pins so long as Elizabeth lived. But she lived into Franklin Roosevelt's America. She lived into the America of subways and airplanes, the world wars. She outlived them all.
I see her with both pity and awe, but when I realize that she spent 57 years of her life perpetuating this myth, then it seems to me that there is a tremendous human tragedy at work here too. It's too bad that Libbie Custer lived in the 19th century. We would imagine that the young woman of her ability and her background and her training who found herself in this similar situation today would probably run for Congress.
On April 4th, 1933, Libbie Custer suffered a heart attack and died, just 4 days short of her 91st birthday. Buried next to her husband at West Point, her grave marker reads simply, Elizabeth Bacon, wife of George Armstrong Custer. Elizabeth Custer wrote, "The day will come when tradition and history would be so mingled that no one will be able to separate them." In her 57 years of undying devotion to her husband's memory,
Prim and proper exterior, there is very definitely a very lively young woman. And I think Custer sensed that from the very beginning. He was persistent, and Elizabeth liked that persistence. And also, too, I think Custer was unpredictable, and that made him somewhat dangerous and therefore also more intriguing as well.
When she did realize that she cared for him, her father found out about it and became furious and put a stop to the relationship. Judge Bacon didn't want his daughter to marry a soldier. He knew the kind of lives they lived and that their life expectancy was not great.
but Libbie and Custer began having clandestine meetings until he was called back to war.
I never was kissed so much before. My forehead and my eyelids, cheeks and lips bear testimony, and his star scratched my face. If I could only see him tonight. Elizabeth Bacon, 1863.
Custer's success on the battlefield also gave him success in love. Once he's promoted to brigadier general, once he's the hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, then it's all right with Judge Bacon, finally, for George to correspond with Libbie. And George suddenly becomes a much more attractive catch to Libbie.
I think there is a myth has grown up that Libbie Custer is a sweet, gentle lady who everybody should feel sorry for. That's part of the myth making about Mrs. Custer. She was a very powerful lady.
From famous wife to powerful widow, Elizabeth Custer rewrote history to create one of the greatest legends of the American West, George Armstrong Custer. But who was the woman behind the legend? Fact and myth are oftentimes blurred.
I think that she created her own myth. It is a pretty picture. The real Libbie Custer was considerably more complicated than the myth would indicate. And there are dark spots in it.
She was born Elizabeth Bacon, better known as Libbie, on April 8, 1842 in Monroe, Michigan. Her parents, Daniel and Eleanor Sophia Bacon, were devout Presbyterians. Libbie's father was a Monroe judge.
There were 4 children born to the couple, but Libbie was the only child to survive. She had a privileged background in that her family was definitely upper middle class. Elizabeth Custer was a person who, even as a young girl, liked excitement. She was a little bit of a tomboy. She liked to climb trees.
Several Union soldiers on leave from the Civil War attended. There, Libbie was introduced to George Armstrong Custer, a rising star in the Union Army. George Armstrong Custer and Libbie Bacon were as different as they come. He was born into a modest family from New Rumley, Ohio, where his father was a blacksmith. Custer, whose nickname was Audie, spent his adolescent years living in Monroe, Michigan, before attending West Point Academy. There he graduated last in his class.
I think the principal contrast between the two would be that he was always boyish, never with a very clear-set group of goals in mind, whereas she was determined and manipulative and intent on achieving certain very clearly defined goals.
Libbie and George came from different sides of the track, and her first impression of him was quite negative indeed. And Elizabeth thought that this young man, who seemed to favor the company of girls of less virtue than she, was not worthy of her attentions.
I believe he liked me, but he was in too much haste, though I admire his perseverance. Elizabeth Bacon, 1862.
If you look at Libbie's pictures carefully, that you can see that behind that
No one woman better personifies the Victorian West than Elizabeth Bacon Custer. She is remembered as the beautiful and devoted wife of George Armstrong Custer, the controversial Indian fighter and Civil War hero. But Elizabeth Custer was much more. After Armstrong Custer's untimely death at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Elizabeth Custer emerged from her husband's shadow to become a noted writer, lecturer, and one of the most powerful widows in American history.
I see my country prosperous, strong, and sure of its destiny. And I know, as the wife of every hero knows, that in some small measure, my life has contributed to that. Elizabeth Custer, 1927.
To this day, Elizabeth, to me, still seems an elusive character. When I look at her diary, I find her a very complicated individual. I am convinced that the public figure that she projected was not always a reflection of the inner Elizabeth Custer.
She came the pathetic figure in Widow's Weeds, which seemed to hold the shadow of a heart-rending tragedy. Candace Wheeler, 1877.
She liked to ride horses.
Libbie spent a happy childhood in Monroe until age 12, when her mother died of dysentery. Libbie wrote in her diary,
"My mother is laid in the cold, cold ground, never to rise again. Why did they put her in that black coffin and screw the lid down so tight?" Libbie Bacon, August 27, 1854.
Judge Bacon, distraught by the death of his wife and the responsibility of caring for his only child, sent Libbie to live at the Young Ladies Seminary School in Monroe. Libbie overcame the death of her mother by excelling in academics. In June of 1862, she graduated valedictorian of her class.
We were all proud of Libbie when it came to her valedictory. There was scarcely a dry eye. So many were there who had watched her through her motherless girlhood. Rebecca Richmond, June 1862.
Libbie returned home after graduation to live with her father and new supportive stepmother. There she quickly became the belle of Monroe, Michigan.
She was a fairly good artist and was hoping that she would have been educated well enough to go to the New York School of Design. And those were her plans until that fateful evening.
That fateful evening was at a Thanksgiving party in November of 1862.